on Fridays. I'm very happy to tell you that we have been very fortunate in doing this series now for nearly 4 years. We are about 260 odd webinars which we have done. We have been very fortunate thanks to Deepak. We did some on G20. We did on New International Economic Order, where Deepak was also the co-chair, I think. Deepak, you are the co-chair of that, right? So thanks to you. And then we did on women empowerment, and we also did on climate. We have been also fortunate that we have had 3 Nobel laureates already come and speak, and we are expecting 2 more, one in February. We are expecting on 21st, and then one in March. So the EGROW webinar series aims to discuss important issues, contemporary issues, not only pertaining that to India, but also globally. And we have been also able to very successfully bring a blend of speakers from India and abroad who could share with us their perspective on these important global issues. As we know, manufacturing and inclusive growth is another important issue, inclusive growth, of course. And I recently had a chance to meet Professor Robert Lawrence, and then we decided his book is complete and he's published the book. Robert, I think the book is out now, am I right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
and then I requested him, and fortunately he had time and he agreed, and so is this presentation. To discuss about this book, we have Professor Deepak Mishra, who's chairing this session. Deepak Mishra is the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations in Delhi. Prior to joining EGROW, he was the practice manager at the World Bank's Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice, responsible for East Asia and Pacific region. He has held various senior positions at the World Bank, including the co-director of the World Development Report 2016, Digital Dividends, country economist for Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, and Vietnam. His research work has been published in various academic journals, including the Journal of Development Economics, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Agriculture Economics. Deepak has also served as the World Bank's country economist for India, based in New Delhi, and working closely with the Government of India and with several state governments, including Andhra, Bihar, Gujarat, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Punjab. Prior to joining the World Bank, Deepak worked at Tata Motors, Federal Reserve Board, and the University of Maryland. He received his MA Economics from the Delhi School of Economics and PhD Economics from the University of Maryland. To take it further, the proceedings for the day, I'm going to invite Dr. Deepak Mishra to take over and conduct the proceedings. Deepak?
Thank you, Charan. That was very generous of you to give such a long introduction to the chair. I think that should be reserved for the speaker. But we are really delighted to have Robert Lawrence, who actually doesn't need a lot of introduction to even the Indian audience, because Robert has been if I can use the word fixture, in the sense somebody who has been attending regularly the Kautilya conference, even the Nimrana conference, and he's the person when it comes to trade policy issues. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to have Robert talk about his book. And the book is super interesting and important and very relevant for India. It is so relevant that even last week, or perhaps this week in the parliament, the prime minister and the leader of oppositions were both having an argument about, did India miss the manufacturing bus, each accusing each other. So there is, just like the American politician that Robert will talk about, who thinks that manufacturing can be a panacea for many of the problems, and also you blame trade and everything for the loss of manufacturing. I think the same story has played out in the Indian context. So the book is very, very relevant for us. So I'm delighted to be able to be part of this seminar. Since Charan did such a formal introduction, I'll do a little bit of Robert, but I want to keep the time for discussion. But just want to tell you that Robert is the Albert L. Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment, a senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics, perhaps in my view, one of the most premier think tank on economic and trade policy issues, and a research associate at NBER. He has taught at Harvard Kennedy School, at Yale, and several other places. He has written some very terrific books on defending globalization, and perhaps one of the most passionate champion of free and fair trade among academics and think tankers that you can find today. So it's a great opportunity for us to hear from Robert. So Robert, if we can do, I don't know how much have we agreed for with Charan, could be about a 30 minutes presentation and then about
Yes.
20 minutes Q&A.
Sounds good.
Terrific. So over to you.
So thank you very much. It's really a delight and an honor for me to give this presentation. As Deepak mentioned, I have a very passionate interest in India, and so to speak to an Indian audience is a real pleasure for me. If you look deeply at the motivations, both in the previous Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, while there are a number of goals, for instance, Biden had environmental goals, he had infrastructure that he wanted to build in the United States, but at its heart, he adopted industrial policies because he wanted to revitalize manufacturing, driven by the view that manufacturing could be very important and provide a major increase in the opportunities for men, especially, who have done poorly in the United States when they didn't have a college degree. In fact, the wages of these men haven't risen for 5 decades. If we turn to Donald Trump, at its heart, the tariffs that he is erecting in a wild fashion. We've just gone through a terrible ordeal with Mexico and with Canada. They are driven, again, by the view that if he erects these tariffs, he will reduce the American trade deficit and increase employment in manufacturing. So manufacturing is seen as a vital sector for not only for the purposes of using the hardware which is produced in manufacturing, but also in providing the opportunities both for people, especially those who are not skilled or educated, and for the places in the United States that have been left behind. My book challenges these views. The essence of the book, can you please do the next slide? So this is the cover of the book. Next slide. The main points of firstly, it challenges the view that it's trade that explains why America, and indeed almost all industrial countries and many emerging markets, have experienced declining manufacturing employment shares for decades. And as was mentioned earlier, in India, this is a preoccupation, the weakness in manufacturing employment, but it is shared by many, many countries all around the world. And each country thinks it's different, and they have unique problems. But what my book hopes to show is that there is something they share in common. You know, everybody knows that as countries develop, the share of farmers declines. Everybody knows that as countries develop, the share of services and those employed in services increases. But what about the share of manufacturing? There aren't such strongly held views, what my book shows is that these declines, which have been experienced in many countries, reflect a set of forces, both firstly technological change in manufacturing. Secondly, in some cases, trade has played a role. And thirdly, often ignored, is the role of demand. And so I build, in the beginning of the book, a simple general equilibrium model, which is very parsimonious. And what I show is that under certain assumptions, and I'll take you through them, this will produce a share of manufacturing in an economy which rises in the initial stages of development and then reaches a peak and declines thereafter. And it doesn't really matter, and this is the stunning finding, I would say, which really surprised me. It doesn't really matter whether countries run trade deficits or run trade surpluses. Once they pass the peak, they experience steady declines in the share of manufacturing employment. There's also been, and we'll touch on this, something called premature deindustrialization, and that is that the countries that have developed later, today's emerging economies, haven't been able to achieve the share of manufacturing employment that was achieved by today's advanced economies when they were at similar levels of income. So, as a result, I challenge the view that manufacturing can play a significant role in providing major help to workers without college degrees and left behind places in industrial economies. I also present evidence that despite both the protectionism in the United States that was adopted under Trump and the industrial policies that were adopted under Biden, the share of manufacturing employment in the United States has continued to decline. And so my central argument is that what we need are more broadly based policies that it isn't that manufacturing isn't important, it isn't that we should ignore our manufacturing sectors, but if we really want to help the people who are left behind and the places that are left behind, we have to broaden the focus to adopt a widespread policies. And I will also argue, ironically, that in the case of India, and if you look at the profiles during the development process, a major reason why manufacturing rises in the initial stages of development is high productivity in agriculture. So do not ignore agricultural policies. Next step. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll briefly, I won't go through all the details on the slides, and we'll circulate these slides. I will describe the changing role of manufacturing in growth and inclusion. Next slide. Historically, and the reason that a lot of our leaders and many people look to manufacturing is that manufacturing was a force for growth and inclusion. It accounted for an important share of overall output and productivity in developed countries for decades. In fact, we use the term industrial economies to denote developed economies. So that indicates how important industrialization was viewed as a source of growth. And it also provided, and I document these using the United States as a test case, a mechanism whereby workers, especially those who are less educated, could get a decent job and join the middle class. And I also show that within the United States, there was convergence among the states up until the mid-70s, and those who were lagging behind could use an increase in manufacturing investment in order to catch up to the other states that were leading. It also changed the politics, where workers were given more say. So manufacturing has been a major force. Next slide. In developing economies, I don't need to tell everyone that it's been very important. It provided people from agriculture to go to get decent jobs, but in both services and in manufacturing, but particularly manufacturing. It's associated with scale economies, backward and forward linkages. It also allows these countries to escape the limitations of their small domestic markets and to export. Next slide, because I think this is very familiar to all of you. But manufacturing's role has changed. In almost all developed countries, the employment share has shrunk steadily since the 1980s. And it's now too small to provide significant shares of employment. In the case of the United States, just 8.5% of their workers are employed in manufacturing. So even if we close the trade deficit in manufacturing, we add up all the jobs that are embodied in the trade deficit in manufactured value added, maybe we'll get to 10. Similarly, in most industrial economies, if you look at the employment shares, they range, between where the US is and other countries, Australia, the UK, and maybe there are others who have a higher share, but it's no higher than 15. So this is not going to have a significant impact. Likewise, it doesn't play a role significantly in regional convergence. If anything, what we've seen is a divergence. We in the US and many other industrial economies have superstar cities. If you go to Europe, you'll see the growth is heavily concentrated in London or in around Paris. And then there are the outlying areas which used to depend on manufacturing, and they today are experiencing significant stagnation. It's also true that the nature of manufacturing has changed. And therefore, today, what's amazing is that the share of fixed capital in equipment is we often think of automation as a major driver, but just as important in the share of fixed capital is intangible intellectual property. Things like software, things like branding. If we look at our automobiles, basically an automobile is a computer on wheels. So the nature of the demand for workers has changed fundamentally. Now, the political consequences of these changes have been seismic. And if you want to understand the rise of populism, there are, to be sure, cultural reasons, but I think a major reason has to do with this idea, particularly in the US, that it's been unfair trade, but in many countries, with the idea that if only they can revitalize their manufacturing sector, they can reverse the changes that I've just described. Next slide. You can see here, this is the share of jobs for men and women in US manufacturing, the blue line being the men. And you can see, if you go back to 1964, almost 30% of all men were employed in manufacturing. The share of women was less. Today, only 5% of women are employed, and the men, these are men, it's well below 15% who are employed. Next slide. Especially true for non-college men. Manufacturing used to employ 35% of all men in 1970, and today you can see the diminution. There's a similar decline for those who have college degrees. It's a little bit less. So The relative share of college-educated men has increased within manufacturing, but nonetheless it declines. It has declined for them as well. Next slide. Now, to me, the most significant way of understanding what's been going on is to look at the real earnings of non-college men in the United States. That's this orange line. It's basically been flat for 5 decades. And it's around, the median male is earning around $40,000. Now, that's not poor. So if you earn $40,000 a year, you have already a lower middle class lifestyle, but you've seen no improvement. And so what we've had in the United States, and what many people talk about income inequality as being a source of discontent. But what they miss is the idea, which I try to push in the book, of non-inclusive growth. We have a significant segment of the population, I'm showing you here, these men are not sharing in the growth we have had in the United States. And so they look at the future and feel that it's bleak. By contrast, men with college degrees have seen significant increases in their earnings, as have the earnings of women. Next slide. So, let me show you some evidence of the structural change that occurs as countries develop. Yes.
I think, Robert, you should continue. I think somebody by mistake has switched on his or her mic.
Okay, next slide, please. So here you can see the United States for 200 years, 1815 to 2017. And the circle shows you the red line is manufacturing share in employment. And so you can see the way in which manufacturing has followed this hump shape in the United States historically. Next slide. This is a sample of 42 countries between 1950 and 2012. And these are the data. I plot GDP per capita in 2015 dollars on the x-axis, and I have the employment share in manufacturing. And lo and behold, you can see the curve emerging as a generalization. So if you run regressions that fit a curve like this, with a dummy variable for each country's unique characteristics, what you're left with is an inverted hump. Next slide. It's true if you do the same thing for every major region in the world. Here you see on the global one, you see on the right, if you fit developed countries, you'll see many of them are past the peak and they're on the downward slope. If you look at developing countries, you can see more of them are to the left, where they do experience some rise. If you look at Africa, the curve emerges. If you look at Asia, the curve emerges. Same with Latin America and same with Europe. Next slide. These are the dynamic Asian trade surplus countries. So you can see the hump in the case of Japan, dating back from 50s. Japan is back to its share where it was in 1953, roughly. You can see the hump for Singapore. You can see the hump for Korea, incredibly dynamic economy, peaked in the 80s, has experienced declining shares. Malaysia developed later, but it too is following this hump shape. Next slide. Now we see China. China's the manufacturing factory of the world. China has almost 30% value added in manufacturing. But what we've seen since 2013, although I must admit that the data on China are hard to obtain for a consistent series in employment, you can see actually there's a decline from 19.3% to 17.5% in the period I was able to find data for, and that's a 12.5 million drop in manufacturing employment in China. Next slide. What is remarkable? I group the countries, and what I report are data from 1995 to 2011, and I'm able to get a sample from TiVo, which is the data set that is being compiled by the OECD. So there are about 60 countries in the data set. And I group them according to whether their trade balance is positive, they have a surplus or a deficit in manufacturing value added. And here I report the data from 95 to 2011, but actually I've extended this to 2018 in more recent data. And what is so remarkable is that the trade balance of the surplus countries as a share of their GDP is basically the same as the deficit countries. And the change in their manufacturing employment share in each of these groups, actually the surplus countries have experienced more declines in the share, a greater decline in the percentage share of manufacturing employment than the deficit countries. And also at the extremes, if I take the top 10 countries, those were the biggest trade surpluses over this period. They have experienced larger declines in the share of their manufacturing employment than have the bottom ones. And actually, a major reason for this is that countries that run trade surpluses tend, everything else being equal, to be more productive in their manufacturing sector. And this means that if you think of a Ricardian type model, they specialize in manufacturing because they're more productive in that sector than in others. And that means fewer jobs, not more jobs. And as they enhance their surpluses, since that is being driven by relatively more rapid productivity growth or higher productivity growth and levels of productivity, fewer jobs are created. Next slide. So these are the major, by the way, takeaways. Now, what explains this particular hub? Next slide. Why is it that this follows? One of the major drivers is technological change. And what you see here is that this is the case of the United States. Productivity, in this case, I've done it both with total factor productivity and labor productivity, has been more rapid in manufacturing. Please, next slide. Yes. So what you see is that the relative prices of manufactured goods have been falling because productivity is faster. Here, this red line is the inverse of the relative price of manufacturing. So when this line goes up, manufacturing goods are getting cheaper. And you can see in the way in which manufactured prices will mirror productivity growth. Next slide. Now, does faster productivity lead to more or less employment? Actually, what you see here is in American consumption, the share of spending has declined over time. If you look at how elastic demand is at the level of a sector, typically it is inelastic. So fast productivity growth leads to declining prices of that sector, relatively speaking, and the demand response is inelastic. And as a result, the share of spending on that sector declines over time. And that's what you see for goods. People are consuming fewer goods, a smaller share of their spending on goods. Next slide. You can also see here I've ranked the share of consumption spending on goods by income quintile. And what you see is that everybody has a declining share of spending over time. This is from 1986 until 2010. However, the share spent by the poor on goods is much higher than the share spent by the rich. Poor people need, essentials, clothing, footwear. They need a bicycle, a motorbike. Rich people, they have tax consultants, they go to a psychiatrist, they have a personal trainer. Those are services. So the composition, and by the way, this is why trade is so important on the consumption side. If you want more inclusive growth, it's very important that you give access, that you not raise the relative price of goods in your economy, because it's going to have an adverse effect on those who are poor. But it also shows you the way in which this productivity growth leads to declining expenditure shares. And income growth does the same. Next slide. So I put these forces together, the role of income and the role of productivity. And I can tell you the story very simply. If I just simply use a closed economy, if you assume there is rapid productivity growth in agriculture, intermediate productivity growth in manufacturing, and low productivity growth in services, and you assume at the sectoral level that demand is inelastic in all of these sectors, you get the process of what happens as countries grow. What happens in the early stages is rapid productivity growth in agriculture will lead agricultural prices to fall, but also spending to increase by less on the agricultural sector, and the spending will spill over into the demand for more manufactured goods and into the demand for more services. And that's why I say in the early stages of development, productivity in agriculture is very, very critical, because agricultural goods and the other manufactured goods and services are all complements to each other. When you lower the price, you increase the demand for the other goods. And spending follows a similar pattern. Eventually, what happens is the agricultural share declines in an economy. And so this source of stimulus diminishes over time. Instead, what happens in more developed countries is it's fast productivity growth in manufacturing that leads to a decline in employment in manufacturing, because spending shifts now as countries have peaked towards more services. So this is the way in which the hump fundamentally emerges. Next slide. Now, what about trade? Trade definitely, in the early years, if you are a relatively small exporter, when you have fast productivity growth in your manufactured sector, while your domestic spending on manufactured goods may decline, you can offset some of that by competing in world markets. And so during the early phase, you can actually have an additional increase in employment that comes from your export surplus. But eventually, as countries get a bigger and bigger share in the markets to which they export, the response to their increased productivity through trade tends to diminish over time. And so there's an added U shape which compounds the effect that's happening with the domestic forces that is operating through international trade. Any given trade surplus for a country that is becoming more and more productive as a share of GDP will result in a smaller increase in the share of employment. And eventually, even with a surplus, you can get declining job creation as a result of the growing surplus in manufacturing, working through this productivity channel. And this is worked out in some wonderful articles that have been written that I cite in the book, which shows this sort of additional effect. Next slide. So I've explained this. Next slide. So I'll just make some quick comments on premature deindustrialization. Next slide. Here I show you quite vividly what I have on the right are the shares of employment relative to GDP per capita in the UK, which is the green, in the US, which is the blue, and Japan. And you can see and then I have the BRICS countries on the left. And what you can see is that the shares which the BRICS countries in this case, and I have India, which is that blue shape, is far lower than achieved by the advanced economies. Next slide. This shows you when you fit the curves and you allow for a constant by each decade, you can see that the curve has been falling down, declining over time. And that's a second universal phenomenon. So it becomes harder and harder for countries to achieve the same levels of manufacturing employment. Next slide. So I then text different potential explanations for why the curve could decline. And a major reason really relates to the fact that technological change in manufacturing has been increasing over time. And what does that mean? So let's just think about India. And I'll give you an intuitive explanation. Suppose India hits a level of per capita GDP, you know, in purchasing power parity terms of $3,000. Well, Indians want to buy a motorbike when they get to that level of income. And so they go out and they buy the motorbike. And however, if India reaches that level late, the motorbike is going to be cheaper than when Belgium reached $3,000 3 decades ago. And if the motorbike is cheaper because you have more access to more productive technologies, it's going to mean that you pay less for the motorbike. And it's going to mean you employ fewer workers to build the motorbike. The result is you now have more money to spend on other things that beyond the motorbike, and you'll spend more money on services. So the curve will shift down because of increased productivity, and the curve will shift inward. You'll create fewer jobs in manufacturing and more in services at any given level of income. So that's an intuitive explanation for why productivity growth is very important. And when I tested it turns out to me the dominant explanation. Some countries you do see that trade has had a positive effect, as you might expect, in mitigating some of the declines. In other cases, trade will actually increase the decline. It depends on the comparative advantage. And then you also see a role for demand, particularly investment. As countries have developed and they grow slower, the share of investment falls. And it turns out investment is very manufacturing intensive by comparison to consumption. So I find that the domestic demand working through investment as well as technological change is the major reason for this premature deindustrialization. Next slide.
Yeah, Robert, if you could wind up in another
Yes.
2 to 3 minutes.
Yes, as I've already said, if you look around, we're seeing today new policies being adopted. And I do believe that manufacturing is important for the digital revolution, for medical research, for decarbonization. We need electric vehicles, for weaponry, semiconductors. All of these things are important. And our industrial policies have been devoted to that. But notice, if you want to produce these products, increasingly, it's all about becoming more skilled. It's all about employing more scientists, more software engineers. It's not about employing more blue-collar workers. So there's a huge skill bias, which is actually being accelerated by the industrial policy competition. And this is adding another source of bias in our growth against those who don't have college degrees. So while these policies may be good may be appropriate in their own right, they are not going to be a source of inclusive growth. And that's what I show in the book, explicitly looking at Biden's industrial policies, but looking at industrial policies elsewhere in the world. So let me conclude then. What I've shown is that there's a universal phenomenon. True, India, like other countries, will have idiosyncrasies, whether your laws are appropriate or not, you can debate, but you need to take account of the fact that you're sharing in something which is universal in nature. If you fail to do that, you think you're going to get effects with your policies, but they may not be sufficient, whatever they are, to offset this underlying force, which I've argued is so powerful in driving structural change. Let me end off there and take your questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for a great presentation. So I would request folks who wants to ask a question to raise their virtual hand, and I hope I can see you. If not, somebody should prompt me. So I'll give you about a few minutes to get coordinated and start raising your hand. In the meantime, if I can take the liberty of asking Robert a question, or basically in some sense giving a simple, another example of what people often call about the servicification of manufacturing. And I think it's not a new explanation, but I'll give you a simple example. I used to work for Tata Motors, as Charan mentioned. And Tata Motors used to make trucks and cars. It was a manufacturing company, massive. And so it was a company which was like, doing everything inside the house, from design, IT, even running a city in this. Over time, they basically outsource and specialize, and they only focus on manufacturing, let all the services be run by other Tata companies. So even in statistics, by that definition, you found that a lot of jobs which were earlier counted as manufacturing became services. So if similar statistical jugglery or whatever statistical changes that has happened over time would mean that many countries which earlier thought this was manufacturing, counted as manufacturing job, have over time and specialization have become more services. Do you think this could, it may not be a interesting explanation, but this could be a more vanilla, but a potential explanation for some of the problems, no?
You're absolutely right. what is being made internally in the sector itself has declined over time at what you call the servicification of production. And that's why I also focus on what's been happening to the price of goods. Because if we looked at the final price of the good, what we have there is the embodiment of the value that's been added within the sector of manufacturing and the value that's been added by the other services, whether it's distribution at the sales end, or whether it's design and the software, at the other end. Those are accommodated into the price of goods. So if it were true that it was simply a statistical artifact, you wouldn't see the price of goods changing, even though you would see manufacturing value added decline and hence employment within the sector. So it is important to kind of reconcile these two measures that we have. And so I would argue that, yes, there is some of the outsourcing that you described. And even what remains is still got a lot more services in it. And that has to do with the intangibles when it comes to the fixed capital, or what we call capital. But nonetheless, I think this U shape is still there. And you can't explain it away by pointing to this structural change, which is absolutely present in the data, in the world.
Yeah, no, I think that the inverted U shape is a pretty fascinating conclusion, and I think pretty robust to me. Looks very robust to me. So I still can't see anybody raising their hand, but I know people must be interested. So I'm not sure if I don't know how to do this, but I know I can call on few people who I'm sure would have something. Like I see Surjit Bhalla there among the audience.
Prakrit wants to ask a question.
Okay, I thought Surjit responded. So if Surjit could come in and then I'll ask.
And I'd raised my hand, but it's not showing up.
Okay.
So Robert, you present some very robust findings across the world, across time. So my question is, what do you say to policymakers that we are going to have a policy, and this is a real happening in India, that, and the critics say, look, why don't you raise the share of manufacturing? So what policies would you suggest, if any, to raise the share of manufacturing, whether in India or any country that comes to you for advice?
You see, I would say that you do need to facilitate manufacturing in the same way as you have to facilitate growth throughout the economy. So it isn't that you shouldn't be focusing on manufacturing, but you should not assume that it should have its special policies by comparison to the services sector. You know, in India, you have ministries who are ministers of industry. I don't see the same ministers of services. So I think you should be paying attention to all of these sources of potential economic growth. That's the first major point. The second is, do you need these goods? What is often thought is that you can, if you enhance your manufacturing, you then will get more jobs through international trade. And you will, to some degree, if you become competitive. But that can also decline over time in terms of the share that it can contribute. If you take an extreme example, if you supplied the whole world with a single product, what I've shown you, in the aggregate, is the demand tends to be inelastic at that level. So there's going to be a kind of a declining share. I would just say And then, you know, to the degree that India has unique hindrances on manufacturing, one key area would be foreign investment, which we've spoken about. You need to adopt new technologies. You need technological diffusion. Another is if your trade structure, the structure of your tariffs, tends to penalize exports because of high prices for inputs. That's another area you have to work on. Because we've seen that countries can enjoy export-led growth when they have zones which allow their exporters access to duty-free inputs. So I'm not saying there aren't a lot of policies that you can use. Oh, and the other thing I've tried to stress, because I know it's relevant in the Indian situation, is that you need more productivity in agriculture. Now, that's very counterintuitive to most policymakers. They want to favor manufacturing, but they don't realize that if you can raise incomes among farmers, and I know, Sajid, you're a real expert on farm incomes, and you love farmers in India. If you can raise their incomes, they're actually going to spend more on goods. They're going to, because the demand for food and is inelastic. So I do think, and since so many people are living in the rural areas, that's a major driver, both of increased demand for goods and for services.
Thanks.
Thank you. I know Prakrut has a question. I'll come to you, but can I just add a question which is based on what Surjit was saying a little bit? So, Robert, I mean, in India, we have states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, which are already industrialized, and they're not really showing any, steady decline or the way we are seeing this inverted U. And as you said, some countries perhaps don't, get to it at a later stage. But then there are states in India which have never industrialized at all. So so to give you, so I think I've heard Prime Minister Modi, who comes from Gujarat, and he says if Gujarat can do it, why can't Bihar? So what holds us back from not industrializing the rest of the states? So there is this kind of organic feeling that if some states in India can do it, the diffusion of ideas, knowledge could help us to bring the rest of the things. What would you tell him? That even if it work in one state, it may not work in another inside the same country.
Well, I do think that at the level of per capita income where India finds itself, it may well still have a lot of scope for moving up the left-hand side of the hump. I'm not saying, I don't want to be interpreted as saying inevitably at India's per capita income, it's going to be on the right-hand side of the curve. I feel that my message really is being directed to the many countries who've already exploited their potential in manufacturing. And the same would apply to states as well. So I wouldn't take what I'm saying as negating the importance, particularly for poorer areas and poorer countries, to enjoy growth in manufacturing. I think it needs to be appreciated that you see there's a tendency to want to close your economy and to engage in import substitution. But what you have to realize is if you take that policy to an extreme, let's just close the Indian economy and productivity growth will lead to less demand and less employment. That's what you need to understand. So if anything, when you're poor, you should not be closing your economy. You want to enhance the productivity of your manufacturing, and you want to get international competitiveness. And that, for the left-hand side of the curve, leads to an increasing share in manufacturing employment. And that's where I think India is. So, so I shouldn't be interpreted as saying, for a country like India, there's no scope in the manufacturing sector. That would be a misreading of what I'm saying.
Yeah, get it, got it. I think, yeah, I mean, there is hope if you can get your policies right, but it
Yes.
obviously needs that open trade policy and other things.
But I was very impressed with the description which Arvind Subramanian gave in a piece he wrote about what has happened in Tamil Nadu when it comes to manufacturing. And so I would say, Prime Minister Modi is right. If Tamil Nadu can do it, they're showing the rest the way to go.
Yeah, good. Prakrit.
Greetings, Professor Lawrence. I am from Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. So I understand, given your argument that manufacturing is declining due to irreversible structural forces. My question is, what should be India's strategy in current geopolitical climate? Because there is a tendency to ask for increasing the manufacturing share, but the level of PPP or the income, should India invest in traditional manufacturing base for the strategic leverage against China, because we import the critical elements pertaining to the national security issues, or pivot towards a digital service-based economy that we are trying to also have a pipe?
Well, I think there are legitimate concerns in being excessively dependent on one trading partner. Unfortunately, the world does not mirror the traditional simple models we teach our students when it comes to full specialization. If you are fully specialized, you could, in fact, be vulnerable in certain sectors. And when countries are willing to use trade as a weapon, which is what we've seen in the case of the United States in the last 3 weeks, it behooves a country to diversify its sources, both from whom it buys and to the markets to which it sells. So there are considerations which have to be brought to bear. But you always, as with most things, have to ask what it's costing you. And in a sense, to me, you'd want to do this in areas where you actually feel eventually the government can withdraw the support once this kind of production becomes, competitive in its own right. So that is a consideration, but it shouldn't dominate. And just because it may be valid in areas which are critical to national defense, it shouldn't be used as a pretext to protect everybody, to protect all sectors. That's where I think this is a dangerous argument. We are experiencing this in the United States. So just as an example, we do have strategic issues when it comes to semiconductors. We need to be leaders there because of their applications in defense. So that's a especially important area. I do not believe we need to specialize in making solar panels, which places like India and China can make for half the cost. So we should not be protecting that sector, despite its role, let's say, in dealing with climate. So we need to be careful in not taking that argument, which I think is valid, and using it for all. And doing that in a political setting is often very difficult.
Okay, I think that's pretty good. So we are almost end of our time. So Charan, should we close it now? Or do you, because I don't see anybody else asking, though I have lots of questions to ask, but I don't want to take too much time. But so let me then close the meeting. I think this is a Friday evening and we don't want to tax people by spending so much of their time on a Friday with us. So we don't want to take it, your liberty of your generosity. But I just want to, I think this was a terrific presentation. And Robert, I think many of us might have read the book or might have heard about it, but it was good to go through that carefully. I thought to me, there are three important takeaways. But of course, this is no way exhaustive explanation of a presentation. But I think the inverted U-shaped relationship between the employment, manufacturing versus the per capita income, that seems like a very robust result. And the fact that the curve itself has come down over time, I think that's a pretty fundamental result to the book. And I think that's something that people in Indian context and the students should actually take a closer look, even across Indian states, to see how that's shaping up. I think that's a very important, robust, stylized fact that sets the tone of the book very well. I think the explanation behind it, as you said, whether countries have surplus trade or deficit trade, they still go through the same transformation. So clearly trade can't be blamed for it. There's something else which is more universal. And in a sense, the fact that this is coming largely because of productivity change, to me, is something that's it's desirable because it's actually going from a positive place, but also something that's inevitable in the sense every country, just the way we saw agriculture coming and going down in terms of employment, manufacturing go through the same process, and we should not be kind of somehow fixated by trying to raise the manufacturing share, but take it as a part of the structural transformation process. So that leads to the policy idea that we should be focused on more broad-based policies and not trying to pick a sector and push that. That's the way we try to not to pick a firm, but even at sector level. So the best solutions are education skills and many of the modern things that you can equip your workers so that they can deal with this structural changes. But it was a fascinating presentation. I think we all enjoyed it. There were 62 people at the peak of the presentation, which is a lot to expect on a Friday evening, Robert. So thanks for the presentation. Thanks for Charan for doing this, and good evening to all of you in India, and good day to those in US.
Well,
Bye.
thank
Very
you.
much.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
I think that was a brilliant summary of the main points that I was trying to convey. But it isn't the end of our dialogue, I hope. And so it was such a pleasure for me to see all of you, albeit virtually, and to talk to you. And I do hope you can get access to the book. It can be obtained virtually. I think it's less expensive if you buy it through Google than if you buy it on Kindle. But thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I'm really delighted that it's had a good reception.
Robert,
Okay, last word to Charan.
Yeah, I must thank both of you to be here. Robert, especially for you to present the book and discuss it at such length. In our country, there has been a recent discussion. Deepak mentioned about the debate in the parliament. There's a beautiful book by Panagria, chairman of the 16th Finance Commission, professor of international trade at Columbia, where he has raised the question, did India really need the high investment industry, or should the investment industrial model be a little different? And as I look at your book, it's a great book, will fix in there, and your inverted U-shaped curves are a signal of something. And now I'm beginning to think maybe in a young demographic country like India, what type of industrialization should have been there? Should have been the heavy industry, or should it have been not that heavy, but involving many more people? And then would the curve have behaved the way it behaved in your book? So that's something which I need to ponder about. And in the meantime, I could share the links to the book of Panagria, as well as the book review that he came and like you have done the book today. He came and presented the book on EGROW about a month back. I'll share with you the link of that. So I must thank you. Yeah, Robert.
I'd love to see that. There was the Financial Times, Martin Wolf actually, I think, wrote a brilliant column on the book.
Yeah.
It's stating it immodestly he did name it as one of the 10 best books in economics for the Financial Times. So I was delighted at the reception that it got, but I could circulate that his column as well as one I wrote for Project Syndicate, which gives the essence in a succinct way.
Right. So I think the industrialization model needs to be really thought through. Should it have been heavy industry? And when you show the inverted U curve, it's more on heavy industry, as well as so much of automation, and with AI coming in and ML coming in now, that inversion is so justified. But if it was in a different type of industrial model, maybe the one which Gandhi was promoting, could have created employment, and maybe that inversion would not have taken place. So I'll share
Well,
I'll share the gist of that book with you and the recording, and maybe the industrialization model needs a relook. With that, this has been such an excellent presentation, and all of us are going to benefit from it, and ones who have attended and ones who have not. We are going to share with others, and I'm sure, Robert, you would like to do so. I'm also going to put it on Twitter, so I think others will benefit from that. Tomorrow, the recording will be available on our website, and then we'll put it on Twitter and open it to the general public. Next week, I'm very happy to share with you, and Deepak, you will be very happy to know, we have the discussion on the book by Amitabh Kant on G20.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are very happy to have this discussion, and the timing will be 4 to 5 p.m. I would welcome you all to the discussion and have the advantage and benefit of what all we did in G20. I know, Deepak, you are far more engaged than I was, and I think you have contributed significantly into the thought process of the G20, as well as I think you are part of the think tank academic exercise that goes along with G20. So I'm sure you will find time to be with us. I'll talk to you, and maybe you should be a discussant for that. I'll come back to you. So I'm requesting each one of you to do think and spare time next week, 4 to 5:30 p.m. for this discussion on G20. Much has happened in G20. Much is happening. Going by the news items now, one country or two countries may not join the next G20 meetings, and all so much is happening. So it'll be interesting, I'm sure, the discussion that will come through next week. So I would welcome you all for that. So once again, finally, on a Friday late evening, many of you have attended and joined us. And most importantly, thank you, Professor Robert and Deepak, for being with us. Have a great weekend. Good night. And have a great day, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.